The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, an update on Real ID and what you and your customers need to know. Hi, I'm Judy Howard with ARC, and I'm excited to introduce our guest presenter for today's session, Simone Davis, TSA Director of Real ID. Simone is responsible for integrating all the Real ID activities with TSA while coordinating with the Department of Homeland Security and external partners. So it should be an exciting presentation, and I hope you've come with all your questions because Simone is the expert to ask. But before we get started, I'm just going to take care of a few housekeeping things. To ask questions during the presentation, go to your control panel over to the right-hand side of your screen, type those in. Simone's presentation will take about 20 to 25 minutes, so we should have the opportunity to get to most of your questions, if not all of them, and the ones we don't get to, we'll respond to directly. We also will be recording this session, and in the next couple of days, we'll post it to our arccorpsite.com under Webinars on Demand. So everyone will have the opportunity to share the session with any of your colleagues that couldn't attend, or if you want to re-listen to it. So without further ado, Simone, I'm going to turn it over to you to get started.
Great. Thank you, Judith. I appreciate the introduction. And I am so happy to be here today speaking to all of you. I'm glad that you're able to join us. So I do not see the slides, Judith. I'm not sure if anyone else can. Okay, there it is. Thank you. You can go to the next slide, please. So generally, when I start these presentations, I ask everyone to please raise your hand if you have a Real ID. So since we can't do that today, I'm just going to state that please check your wallets and your purses and make sure you have a Real ID. And if you do not, please go and obtain one as soon as possible. So for Real ID, on May 3rd, 2023, that is our enforcement date, and on that date, every air traveler 18 years of age or older will be required to have a Real ID compliant driver's license or state-issued identification card, or an acceptable form of ID that's listed on our TSA website. So you can go to the website that's listed here on the slide, and you will see that full list, but that includes things like passport, military ID, registered tribal identifications, and a list of others. So I encourage you to go there so you can share that with your clients, your customers. Next slide, please. So with Real ID date coming up pretty soon, we do have slight challenge, which is multiple folks continue to get non-compliant driver's license. We're not sure if this is an issue of just not knowing any better, or if it's an issue of it's an easier way to do it. And I'll explain that later as we get into the brief. But right now, I just kind of wanted to give you some of the numbers so that you will understand where we are. So there's 55 of the 56 jurisdictions are compliant. So we have 56 because that's the states as well as the territories. And so the 56 is the American Samoa, and we're working on that now. The reason why it wasn't compliant is because they did not allow us to come up there to certify them during COVID. So they just opened up, so we're working towards getting them certified now. So out of the 277 million total state IDs at driver's license issued throughout the nation, there are 136 compliant Real IDs. And that's approximately 49%, as you see here. And then there's 38% are what we call non-compliant. And then there's 12% legacy. So let me explain that. So what we consider compliant, every state and jurisdiction, so all 56 had to become certified once the Real ID Act went into place. So what that means is DHS, had to go into the state and make sure that they were able to create Real ID compliant cards. And if they weren't, then they were not certified. So over time, all of the 56 jurisdictions, became certified and able to create the Real ID compliant driver's license and state IDs. So for a compliant card, that is an identification, state ID or driver's license that was done after the state became certified. So you have a Real ID compliant driver's license or state ID. Non-compliant, again, is someone who either renewed their driver's license or got a new driver's license after a state was certified, but they chose to get non-compliant versus compliant. And then a legacy card is what we consider to be a card that has not changed since the state became certified. So you're an individual who holds a driver's license or state ID, and you've done nothing with it since the state has become certified to issue Real ID. So that's where those numbers come from. And as you can see, the non-compliant number is much higher than we'd like it to be right now. So our adoption rate, and this is the nationwide adoption rate, considering all the states, is 0.5% per month. So the number, the percentage of Real ID card holders goes up by only 0.5% each month. And this number used to be 1.5% prior to the pandemic. Once the pandemic came, it dropped to 0.5 and it had still not recovered. And the reason why it dropped, obviously the DMVs had shut down, and of course people weren't coming out, and they didn't have the opportunity to renew online at that time. So the numbers dropped drastically. However, the good thing is many individuals have other acceptable forms of ID, as I stated, in the form of a military ID, a passport, or tribal ID. And so we want to make sure people understand that we have a list of acceptable identifications that are authorized to use at our TSA checkpoints. And so I think that message is a message that needs to get out that is just as important as telling people to get their Real ID. Because what I would hate to happen is upon enforcement date, you show up to travel and you don't have a compliant driver's license, so you're turned away. However, you have a passport at home on your dresser. So we're trying to make sure people understand, you can fly domestically with your passport, and that's absolutely okay. So the Real ID Modernization Act, it was passed in December of 2020, and it was basically passed to just update the Real ID Act from its original date, which was 2005, with some more technology and advancements that have occurred over time. So two of the things that came out of the Modernization Act is the remote application process and the mobile driver's license. So the remote application process authorizes people to apply for their driver's license, renew their driver's license from their home. So right now, a lot of the states allow that, and so people do that. However, you cannot do that for a Real ID at the present time until we finalize the regulation that authorizes that to be done utilizing a Real ID. We have to make sure that it is digitally sound and secure as we need it to be to measure up to the hard card of the Real ID. So that is happening now. That is being worked through DHS with TSA supporting, and we're pushing forward to get that done. I don't have any particular dates, so I'm not going to put any out there. However, once we get the regulation done, the state still would have to set up the process within their state to make sure that that can be accomplished for a Real ID. So that'll be coming in the future, but hopefully that'll help people in their decision in whether to get a compliant Real ID driver's license or a non-compliant. And then For the mobile driver's license, some of you may know that a lot of the states are already doing this as well, and that is using your driver's license on your mobile device to come through the checkpoint. Now, although it is happening now, again, same with the remote process, it will not be authorized for a real ID after the enforcement date unless we pass this regulation as well. So TSA, again, and DHS are working hard to get this done and get this in effect so that upon enforcement date, that process will be able to go forth and people will be able to use their mobile device for their real ID as well, and not just their non-compliant as they use now. All right, next slide, please. So this is probably one of the most important things that we are doing. As I stated, some people know what Real ID is, but they don't understand the full implementation of how it's going to go forth upon enforcement and what that means if they do have one, if they don't have one. They just have heard it somewhere in passing. And then they surely don't realize that the acceptable forms list is there for them to use as well. So again, getting information out to the public, to your clients, to the traveler is one of the most important things we can do. And we have a lot of work to do in this area. We want to make sure that folks are informed of this deadline. So we're seeking to continue our advertising campaign. We had the Be Your Real ID Self campaign that kicked off in 2021. It was paid advertising. We're in multiple media channels, and we interviewed our stakeholders. We had 90 plus stakeholders, industry folks involved in the creative. So it was a very successful, great campaign that we'd like to kick off again. Unfortunately, it ended in September of 2021. However, all of the creative assets still remain as a campaign toolkit for your use. So you can go to the dhs.gov/realid website, and you can get things to utilize in the social, digital, print and audio, and even video assets. And we would hope that you would do that. That would help us out greatly. We're working right now to identify some funding to kick the campaign off once again. Again, I don't have a date for that, unfortunately, but once the funding comes in, we will get back into market in our multimedia channels and hopefully make the public more aware of what we have going on. Right now, though, we are doing a lot of full court press on industry partnerships and meeting with our stakeholders and trying to just get the word out in that way. We want to make sure that people understand we would like them to work with government. It is very important that the message comes from more than us. We want to make sure the public understands and the travelers and your partners understand that this is a necessary thing. This will help your travel become more smooth, more ease as you commute through the transportation sector. And so we're asking that you all would support us in this. It's very important to us that it's not just coming from government, right? It is a government regulation, but we want our partners to feel a part of it and partner with us on this and getting this out. We are doing proactive engagement with all of our partners, state and local as well, not just our industry partners, but we're talking to the DMVs. We have a plan to go out and speak with governors, just a lot of communication so that when individuals go in the DMV, they're aware of what it means to either get a real ID or a non-compliant driver's license, because we'd hate for someone to select a non-compliance out of ignorance, and there's someone who flies maybe not even often, but even 2 to 3 times a year, it's going to be quite inconvenient, right? So we're hoping that we can get the DMVs to spread the message a little stronger than they have been, and just making sure individuals are aware of what that means, and how it's going to affect them, how their decision is going to affect them. So we're working on all of that. Again, looking for your partnership there in any way that you can. Be greatly appreciated. All right, next slide, please. So some of the things that we're doing inside TSA to make sure that we are ready. If you can imagine, so I just read the numbers to you of how the non-compliant numbers are at a rate that we really don't like, wish it was much lower. So once we enforce Real ID as people come through the checkpoint, it could be an absolute nightmare if we are not prepared to handle the folks who aren't compliant as well as the compliant. So one of the things we have going on is upgrading our CAT software, and our CAT machine is the credential authentication software, and this is the machine where you slide your driver's license in and it comes back out. We are getting them out in force to a lot of our airports. It helps with the security of the identification, but it also is we're making sure that it's able to read all of the 56 territorial and state identifications, the new Real IDs as they come out. So that is happening right now. Also, the Aircraft Operator Standard Security Program. This was a part of the Modernization Act that came out in December of 2020. This is one of the things that we also put out to help communicate to the public and help with the traveler to understand what's needed before they even get to the checkpoint. So at home as they're making the reservation, and then when they're ticketing, and then when they're trying to check their baggage, understanding that a Real ID is needed. So this change required all aircraft operators to notify the passengers of the Real ID requirements a year prior to the implementation date. And they are to notify them, as I stated, during the reservation, during their check-in process, and then even at the checked baggage process. So hopefully to move people back from the TSA checkpoint, so they won't show up without it. They'll understand it is required, or you might as well not go to the checkpoint. We are also looking into technology. We're looking into solutions that may help us and ease the burden should we be at a place where there are a lot of non-compliant individuals coming to the checkpoint. We have a lot of work to do in this area. As I stated, we're investigating. However, we do understand that we could build something that could greatly help support as we go to enforce. So we're looking into that now. And we're also looking to design a data collection and analysis capability. Now, this would help inform our decision makers as they move out with Real ID prior to enforcement date and as we enforce. Now, what this does is it will help us understand the type of identification that is used at our TSA checkpoint. So it'll give us a number of Real ID compliant driver's license that were used and the non-compliant driver's license that were used, as well as passports used or other sources of acceptable IDs, vice non-acceptable ID. So right now, when we make decisions concerning Real ID, whether it's to extend the date or other decisions with Real ID, the only information that we have is the adoption rate and of the non-compliant versus compliant from the DMVs of how people are either getting their Real ID or they're getting non-compliant Real IDs. And so that number, although a good number, and it was all we had, clearly is not based on the traveler. It's just based on the public, the American public as a whole. And so what we don't know is out of the non-compliant, yes, we don't like that number. We wish it were down lower. But out of the non-compliant, right now, what we don't know is how many of those folks travel or even plan to travel. And so if that number's low, then it's not as bad, right? But if that number's high, we have a whole problem at the checkpoint. So this data collection at the checkpoint is going to let us know what's really happening at our TSA checkpoints across the nation. So we will be able to make a decision based on the travelers, not just the American public as a whole. So that's going to help support, again, a lot of the decisions that are made surrounding Real ID prior to enforcement, as well as once we begin to enforce. And we should have those mechanisms up and running in the very near future. We're testing now, we're collecting some data now, and it's all anonymized. There's no person-centric data. It's just literally the type of identification. So there's no Privacy Act information or anything like that that we're collecting on individuals, just type of ID used. All right. I think I'm ready for the next slide. Yes, thank you. So for our path forward, again, it's too early to estimate the impact that Real ID will have at our checkpoints. But again, once we begin collecting all the data, measuring that up to the DMV data that we collect from around the country, we'll be able to make more decisions. But the reality is, it doesn't matter if we stick with the date that we have, May 3rd, 2023, or for some reason the secretary decides to push it further down the road, it is still important to engage and push the message forward, because if nothing is done, then the non-compliant ID cards may continue to rise. So it's very important that we continue to talk to the traveler. We continue to implement our plan at TSA and push forward as much as we can. So again, engaging with the public, engaging with the traveler is one of the most important steps that we can take right now, especially with the date coming up next year. And again, we need your help with that. But I want everyone to still also understand the acceptable forms list. I think that's very important. As much as I preach Real ID, I think the most important thing is that folks are able to come to the TSA checkpoint and get through in a secure manner, utilizing the proper form of identification. So as I stated, we are also partnering with DHS to engage with the states at a greater level to deal with the low rates of the Real ID adoption. There are some states that are lower than others, so we definitely want to focus on them and try to get them to turn around. We are pushing very hard and requesting our funding so we can kick off this public advertising campaign again. We definitely want to do that because right now, you know, as much as we engage, as I'm engaging with you all right now, you know, travelers, most frequent travelers are pretty much well versed on a lot of stuff. You know, they understand TSA pre-check, the global entry. So they stay kind of well versed and caught up on what's needed and really what's needed to get them through the checkpoint with the most ease. So, but what we need to reach the folks who don't travel as often, the folks who may travel once a year to the family reunion or to see their grandmother or heaven forbid funerals and then of course weddings. So we want to capture those folks as well, because regardless if you fly once a year or once a month, if you don't have the proper ID, you cannot get through the TSA checkpoint. So we believe our advertising campaign will reach the far lengths that we may not reach as we talk to our industry partners. So we're hoping that we can get that back up and running once again. And then just simply, as I stated, we're designing our implementation process, and we're hoping to, of course, minimize any effects that may happen at the TSA checkpoint. We want to make sure that remains a smooth process. I mean, I know sometimes the lines may get long, but folks are constantly moving through at a nice, smooth pace, and that's what we want to have continue after enforcement. We want to do the data collection so we can understand the numbers at the checkpoint. And of course, as always, protect the safety and security of our travelers, which is number one, always for TSA. So I am done with my brief. I hope I didn't go through it too fast. I tried to stay on a good pace. Hopefully you were able to write down your questions or remember them. Next slide, please. And so you can reach us with anything that you have, anything you think of weeks or months down the line. Please reach out to David Lim. He is our Executive Marketing Officer, and he will CC me on anything that you have for us, and we'll be sure to get back to you. But right now, I'm going to try my best to answer as many questions as you have. Judith?
Yep, great. Thank you, Simone. Great presentation. We do have quite a few questions, so let me try to go through them. Some may be repetitive. Some of this information you may have already given us, but I think it's important maybe to just, again, if it has been answered already, just to answer it again, just so that everyone is clear if they're still asking these questions.
I don't mind.
The first one, perfect. The first one is someone who has a CDL commercial driver's license, will that still be needed? Would you still need an updated Real ID to travel if you have that commercial driver's license?
So two things. I don't want to answer that too quickly, but so the bottom line, this is how I'll answer that. The bottom line is you do need a Real ID compliant driver's license to get through the TSA checkpoint. Now, what I don't know for sure if a CDL is on our acceptable forms list. So you see how that it's two ways.
Right.
If the CDL is on the acceptable forms list, for some reason, I just can't remember right now. But if it is, then it's fine. But if it isn't, you still need a Real ID compliant driver's license. So
yeah, and Simone, would that be listed in your toolkit? I think you provided that toolkit web address at one point in the presentation. Would it be there?
So two things. The toolkit is for advertising and marketing.
Okay.
Right. So it has the media, it has the digital, the print, all that you would need to advertise and market Real ID on your websites or wherever you want. What I mentioned was the TSA.gov website would have the acceptable forms list. And that was in the presentation. I mean, you could go to TSA.gov and muddle your way through, but the exact link is in the presentation. I'd have to go back and look at that.
Okay, great, great. And again, this presentation will be recorded, so we will have that. And Simone, maybe again, if you do have that before we get off the presentation today, you can recite that web address, would be great.
All right, I just found it, so let me give it. It's, of course, www.tsa.gov/security-screening- after screening, it's a backslash, identification.
Great. Thank you, Simone.
You're welcome.
That'll be very helpful, I'm sure, for everybody on the webinar today. The other is, let's see what this one is. My local AAA said they can reissue a license for Real ID. Is that correct? That doesn't sound correct, but is that true?
AAA?
Yeah.
So does AAA normally issue a driver's license? I don't think so. So
not that I'm aware of.
Right. No, your Department of Motor Vehicles, because again, as I stated in the brief, the issuer of a Real ID has to be certified to issue a Real ID. And so the states and the territories have all been certified to issue a Real ID. So it's important that you utilize that.
Okay, great. The next question is, what does a compliant driver's license look like? Is there a difference between compliant and non-compliant?
Yes, so the compliant, most states have a little star up in the corner. I think one of the states have a bear, maybe that's Alaska. And but there will be a right up in the right-hand corner, there should be a star or a symbol from your particular state. I think there's only a few additional symbols other than a star, but that will show the real ID.
Great. And I think you had them here in the presentation. I think there's like 5 different ones. So great. And everyone may want to check their licenses. I had one and didn't even know it. So you might be already have it, don't know it. The other question, here's another question. Does global entry card qualify for a real ID?
Your global entry card is an okay. No, so I'm gonna give that twofold again because I don't want to speak out of turn.
Okay.
So when we say qualify for real ID, so let's separate that because that was the other question as well with the CDL. So nothing qualifies for a real ID except a real ID, a compliant real ID, driver's license, or state issued identification card. Now, TSA has a list of acceptable forms of ID at the checkpoint. So now is global entry, is the CDL, is the, are those on our acceptable forms list? That's the question. So
Right.
yes, so you can check our list to see if they're on there. But the only thing that is considered a real ID is a state issued driver's license that is compliant or a state issued identification card that is compliant.
Okay, great. And then they can check for these other acceptable forms on your site. Perfect.
Yes, yes.
And this question, and maybe you've answered it here, the passport card is acceptable, correct?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
That I know. But our list, you will see our list. I'm not going to say it's very long, but it's a nice size list, which is why I can't quote it right off the top of my head. But so please, I encourage everyone to go check.
Great. This question is someone, I think you just stated it at the end here, but someone who shows up at the airport without proper ID will be denied entry through TSA. Is that correct?
Yes, upon enforcement.
Okay. So it's really important for all customers to be aware, all travelers to be aware of when this goes into effect, which is is it May 1st of 2023?
May 3rd of 2023.
May 3rd.
And so along with Real ID, TSA is looking at across the board at all of our identification policies because right now there are different little policies and nuances that we allow that we are tightening up on. So you definitely need to have an acceptable form of ID, which also would be a Real ID on top of that. So either one.
Okay, great. And this is an interesting question. Are passports of foreign countries acceptable?
Again, I don't know. I'm so not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure on that. I'm sorry.
Nope,
I'm
that's
really
okay.
sorry. I don't have this acceptable forms list in front of me. Maybe I should have got it.
And just so everyone on the webinar knows, Simone will be getting a list of all these questions, and they will provide some written responses. So maybe draft up, Simone, maybe an FAQ to some of these questions, and then we can post that on our corp docs.
Oh, that sounds great.
Yeah, we'll be happy to post that.
Will do.
For some of these that we need research.
So let me add that what I will not do is post our acceptable forms list because it can change. It's fluid.
Yep.
Something can come off, something can be added. So I don't want that to be a permanent list on your website.
Yeah, and maybe some of these can be just as easy as what that website is for acceptable. Maybe we can theme some of these questions out, Simone.
Okay.
To be helpful for everyone.
Good.
Okay, great. And everyone still keep writing in your questions while we have Simone here. to answer. If your ID has one of those stars icon on your ID, then you have a REAL ID, correct? I believe that's a correct answer, right? Yes?
I believe that is correct. I
That's
believe.
okay. Perhaps if I'm ID incorporated in your signature. Perhaps information on your REAL ID can be incorporated in our signature line. That's a great thing for anybody that does communicate via email to a lot of their customers, which most of us do. That's a really a great thing to probably put on there. The real purpose of the REAL ID, if Simone, if you just mind kind of truncating that explanation a little bit, kind of just reiterating the importance of the REAL ID and really what that purpose is.
Oh, absolutely. So the Real ID is more secure than the regular driver's license, which is one of the reasons why the states have to be certified to create it to make sure they have uh, uh, the security within the card. And that's why while we're trying to create this mobile driver's license, it's very important that that same amount of security carries through to the mobile, which is why the government has to write up a whole regulation on it and what will be required of the states for that. So that's the reason. It's a more secure type of identification.
Okay, great. Thank you, Simone, for that. Here's a question. Let me see if I can get this one. The thing is, I'm a little confused. ID, there's a non-compliant REAL ID, or is there a non-compliant only if the traveler does not have a REAL ID? I think there is. Well, I'll let you explain.
Okay, so sorry, hate that I confused you with that. So when we say non-compliant Real ID card, yeah, it's kind of oxymoron. It's just that you're non-compliant with Real ID. So that just means you have a regular driver's license that is not compliant with Real ID, which means you do not have a Real ID compliant driver's license.
Great. Thanks, Simone, for clarifying that. I'm sure there was myself and others, because I thought there was a non-compliant one and a compliant one, and I wasn't really quite sure either. So thank you for that question, and
You're
thanks,
welcome.
Simone, for the clarification. Why is the regular driver's license no longer good enough?
Again, it's just the security. So the Real ID Act came out of 9/11. After 9/11, it was one of the things that was pushed forth. It came into action in 2005. And of course, a lot of work has been done after that. And then now we're just trying to get to the point where we can actually enforce it. First, we had to go through all the state process of getting them certified to offer up a compliant Real ID card, but it's just more secure.
Great. And I think this question has been asked a lot. It's just a variation. Does the traveler have to show us both a standard driver's license and global entry card? There are travelers that do not want a Real ID or enhanced driver's license. I think what we talked about, if it's just a standard driver's license without the Real ID component, that doesn't work. And the global entry card, we'd have to check to see if it's on that compliant list, right? Or acceptable.
Yeah, I want to say it is. I'm almost sure it is. But if you have global entry, you probably have a passport too. So.
Yeah, right. So in a passport, definitely covered. Okay.
So let me just say this because everybody seems to be asking the question, right? So in order to get through the TSA checkpoint, you must have an acceptable form of ID, which is on that list. Right now, the list contains all of these IDs, but also a state issued driver's license or ID. That's on there. After the enforcement date, that line is going to change and say a Real ID compliant state issued driver's license. So it's just, so right now a driver's license is one of the many acceptable forms. After enforcement, it's just going to change to a Real ID by just a basic driver's license. But so all of those can get you through the checkpoint. You don't need to double up. You just need to have one acceptable form of identification.
Right. And then just for clarification, what I think I hear you saying then is the plain driver's license will just change to a real ID compliant driver's license,
Yes,
along with all the other forms that are
yes.
acceptable today. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's go to this question's long. Let me see if I can get it. Does, nope, let me go to the next. Okay, that's long. Let me go to this. Ms. Perdana, do you have? Just bear with me 1 second.
Okay.
Oh, this was, again, this comes under the different forms of what's acceptable. If I have TSA, do I still need the real ID? And you'd have to check that list, right, Simone, to see.
No, I can answer that one.
Okay, okay, good.
So I think the question is, if you have TSA pre-check, you still need a real ID? And the answer is yes, and here's why. TSA pre-check does not come in the form of a card or any form of identification. It is a KTN. It's a number, a known travel number that you put in your reservation, which authorizes you to have TSA pre-check. So you still need a form of identification. So you would still need your driver's license, which, yes, after enforcement date, it would need to be Real ID compliant.
Great, thank you. This is like a state question. Is the enhanced license in Washington state the same as a real ID? Do you know that, Simone, or would they have to check with their DMV?
So, no, I can answer that. Enhanced, it still needs to be Real ID compliant, regardless of whatever the driver's license is. It must be Real ID compliant.
Okay, great. And one of the things is, can we send the links after this call? And I can. And Simone, maybe you can send me those specific links to the where on TSA, that one that you gave with the backslash, where they can find those acceptable forms. And I can put that in a follow-up email to everyone.
Okay. And again, I want to stress with our acceptable forms, we do go through a process of making sure that the identification meets the proper standards to be placed on our acceptable forms list. But sometimes an identification will fall off those standards and can be removed. So I say that because the list can be fluid. It doesn't change often, but it can change. So please understand that. It's not just a standard static list.
Yeah, so it's something to keep pretty handy, is that web address and that specific area on your website to check regularly for us.
Yes.
Good information. Can an expired passport be acceptable if one doesn't have a real ID to travel domestically?
So it depends. There is a TSA authorizes an expired identification for a a reasonable amount of time, but not forever. Like like 5 years expired. No, you're not probably not getting through. But a reasonable amount of time, because we understand things expire, right? But if you just have a passport that you do not intend to renew, it's not going to last forever. You're not going to be able to do that for a long time. So you need to renew that.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm just scrolling through some of these questions. We'll repeat, like I said, we'll get that website information. Simone, I'll get that from you and I'll put it in the follow-up email.
Okay.
And then there is some back and forth going on in regards to AAA. And this one says our state has a contract with AAA to issue driver's licenses. So that then I'm assuming, well, I shouldn't assume, but then you would check with AAA if they can issue the real ID driver's license. Right, Simone, is that correct?
That is correct. So if your state is in connection with them to issue driver's license for the state, then they have to have been a part of the certification process. Now, if they were not, they will not be authorized to issue Real ID compliant driver's license. So I would definitely check and ask.
Great. Yeah, so though anyone, and there's quite a few with the AAA, just check with then your AAA office if they can issue driver's license, if they can issue the Real ID ones. Let's see. I think you went over what non-compliance means
Yes.
quite a bit. This one, for example, forms. I see that people's names have added a full middle name. We need to update a frequent flyer. So all of this, they're just making a statement that everything should be in sync. If you have your driver's license with the middle name, I think what they're saying here is make sure that everyone's frequent flyer numbers and programs are updated to match, so all the names match. There's been a couple of requests to extend your deadline. Let's see here. Okay. And the website address, a lot of people have asked if that can be repeated.
Send that out.
Like I said,
Well, why don't we go backwards? I hate to bother you, Judith, but if you go back to, I think it's slide 1 or 2, and that way everyone can see it. So I'm not making mistakes with slashes and dashes.
Oh, sure. Yep, I can certainly go back to that. No worries.
There it is.
Yeah, and I'll leave that up so that everyone can have the opportunity to write that down as well.
Great. Thank you.
Of course. And I'm just looking at some of the other questions. If anyone else has a question, please type it in. We'll leave that web address up there. Thank you, Simone, for bringing that up. And I don't know if this is a question, Simone, that you would know the answer for. How are airlines going to handle people not having correct forms of IDs? Are they going to offer waivers, refunds? Is this going to be like an email blast? So if someone gets to the airport, they can't get on a flight, that would be totally up to the airline what those rules will be.
Yes, you're correct in that.
Correct.
You're correct. Yes. Which is why it behooves them to make sure their travelers know, which is why they're doing all that they can in the reservation systems and ticketing and things of that nature. All right, I have the list in front of me, so I'm going to say global entry, of course, is definitely good. And then I was asked about one more that is on here. What was it? It was the foreign government issued passports are good.
Oh, good. Great. I think one was expired passports for domestic travel.
So the thing with expired, it's not going to say it on here, but we allow it because you could expire accident, you weren't paying attention. So we do allow that, but it is for a very short period, maybe 3 months, 6 months, I can't remember, but
since the expiration.
You cannot be expired like 5 years and still use it.
Okay.
You will not get along with that. But yeah, so that'll go on for a little while. I just don't, it's not going to say it on the acceptable forms list.
Okay, and this is a good question. What about children, minors that do not have driver's licenses? What do they need as a Real ID, or do they need one?
They don't. It's only 18 and above.
Okay. That's good information. Okay. And this question, and you just answered it, can someone that's a foreign traveler, can they use their passport to travel within the United States? And yes, the answer is yes to that.
Yes, that is
Yeah,
acceptable.
I think we've answered most of the questions. If anyone, we'll just take a couple more minutes to see if there's any other questions that come in. Simone, is there anything that you would like to close with while we see if any more questions come in?
Yes, so please reach out to David and myself with any other questions you have, any questions on helping support the pushing out our information, getting the toolkit or anything of that nature. We gladly support in that area. And I just want to say I appreciate you all for having me today and appreciate any support that you can provide us in getting the message out.
Great. And as you were speaking, there were some questions that came in. So thank
Okay, great.
you, everybody. Let me just get back to them. I jumped forward. Hang on one second. It says in one of the slides, it stated aircraft operators are to notify passengers of real ID requirements and implementation date during reservation. So how will they be notified exactly? And one of your slides, it stated aircraft operators are to notify passengers. So I guess they're asking how will that occur?
So it happens online. A lot of them have it up and running right now. So once you go to hit the reservation, it will state that you will need a real ID come May 3rd, 2023 in order to board. So you won't just purchase your ticket, thinking you can get on the flight when you really can't. So a lot of them have it up and running right now. So if you even go through and you're not really, just go through as if you're making a reservation, you should see it pop up.
Okay, great. Thank you. This is a good question. Are we allowed to post these links on social media and websites?
The TSA.gov. I
The
believe we are.
Yeah, I think it's the one where it shows the acceptable forms of payment.
Um,
The link on the first slide here.
so I don't think that's a problem simply because it's on our website.
Mhm.
So we want people to know. I don't see that as an issue. But as I stated, I'll always do the link. Don't do the list because it can change. Always just point them to the link only.
And that way they're guaranteed that they have the most updated forms of identification.
Yes, yes, because we want people to know this. So whatever you can do to get them to understand to bring one of these forms of ID through the checkpoint. We do not wish to turn anyone away.
Great. And then I think you said there was a toolkit.
Yes.
And this said, can you send us a flyer? I think in the toolkit, you probably have all different kinds of mediums that people can utilize. Is that correct?
That is correct. And David, our Chief Marketing Officer, if you'd like to speak to that, to some of the stuff that's there that they may find interesting or useful.
Yes. Hang on. Am I
There you
unmuted? Yeah, okay. So when you go to the toolkit, I think the most useful asset is probably the infographic. And if Judy, if you can just send the infographic out to everyone along with the link, I think the infographic is the easiest to share because otherwise the digital assets, there are assets that we use in the advertising campaign. So there are static assets, there's video, there's audio. There are literally hundreds of assets in the Be Your Real ID Self campaign. But I think the one that has the highest utility is an infographic. So on one PowerPoint slide, if you will, it's the who, what, when, where, why, and answers most of your clients' questions.
David, can you repeat? I think correct me if I'm wrong here, I think the link that's showing is for the list of acceptable IDs. Can you repeat what that address is for the toolkit?
Oh, yeah, so the toolkit is www.dhs.gov/real-ID and then /campaign toolkits. But if you just go to dhs.gov/real ID, you'll see a tab on the upper right-hand side that says campaign toolkits. And if you click on that, that will give you a segmentation of the different kinds of assets. And if anyone has a problem or any questions about what's in the toolkit, just feel free to either call or just email me, and I'll respond to you very quickly back.
Okay.
I think it's on slide 4, Judith, if you want to.
Oh, sure. I will do that.
And that way everybody can screenshot it or.
Yep.
There it is.
Perfect. Here it is right here. Great.
Oh, yeah, there it is.
Yep. Here's to the campaign toolkits. There was another question that I do want to get to as we are kind of coming to the close of our time with everybody. Oops. Hang on, where'd it go? I think it said, and I've lost it here in my list, but I believe the question is, what is needed to get a real ID? Is it different per state, or is it the same documentation that is required to get a real ID? So if they go to the DMV, does each state have its own requirements, or is there a federal like list of you need, I don't know, X amount of proof to say who you are?
So you do need, there are some federal things that are definitely need. I mean, across the board, what is needed. You used to need your physical Social Security card, but now you can actually verbalize that. But they will need your Social Security number. They'll need. It does cost a little more, and that's that is the cost is individual to states. So it is a little more than a basic driver's license, but not, it's not exorbitant. And you also need, I want to say they do a fingerprint. It's losing me now. How about I send that back so everybody can actually have what's required?
Yep.
Because I don't want to fumble with that.
That is perfect. What if an adult, and we have just time for probably 2 more questions. What if an adult does not have a license? Then they would have to go to the list of other forms of acceptable IDs, correct?
That is correct.
So if you don't have a driver's license and will not get and don't want one, or can't get whatever that is, just go to the list of what else other forms are compliant, acceptable IDs. And that would go to the question of the person that doesn't drive. Will anyone?
But states do issue just state issued IDs that would have to be Real ID compliant after the enforcement date as well for the non-driver.
Great. This one said, will the DMV, when you go to renew your driver's license, does it upgrade to the Real ID? This person said that happened in their state. So I believe that's probably state by state.
It is state by state, and right now, very few states, I want to say 6, will give a Real ID only. But the rest of them, you can still renew and get a non-compliant. So you have to be very specific because, as I stated, right now, some of the DMVs don't, I don't want to say force the issue, but they don't explain the issue. They don't tell you, hey, you're not going to be compliant. They don't share that information. And so you have to be knowledgeable and ask for it.
Great. And I'm just going to go to the end here, and I'm just going to say a big thank you to Simone Davis. Thank you very, very much for taking the time to join us today and to be with us to present this really valuable information and answer questions. Also, thank you, David Lim, for help working with me to get this all set up. Really appreciate it. But most of all, thank you for everyone that joined us on the call today. We really appreciate it. If you do have further questions, and it is specific to Real ID, I did pull up David's email address again, david.lim@tsa.dhs.gov, and he will copy in Simone Davis, or you can do that. But he would be the main contact. If for some reason after we leave here today you forget those email addresses, please feel free to send me a note and I'll make sure to pass that along. And again, this presentation's been recorded and we will post it on arcbook.com under webinars on demand. So again, thank you everyone for taking the time out of your busy days to join us this afternoon. And Simone and David, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you so much.